Hello, Susan Corbett, Custom Machine Quilter. Today we're going to talk about this flying geese quilt. It's old. I don't know how old exactly. It's made out of these great shirting fabrics, all kinds of plaids and checks, and a couple of little prints here and there. It's old and crinkly, and there were only a couple of stains in it. What I really liked about it was the placement of the colors. So you got some rows of light colored patches and then predominantly blue that appear to go in the other direction. So the client and I thought about all kinds of different things, and I ended up with lines in the light colored fabrics and big feathers in all the rest. So here I'm at the bottom of the quilt. It's loaded lengthwise so that I can quilt from left to right. That's how my machine likes to go. There would be too many stops and starts if I had it loaded the other direction. So it's kind of heartbreaking to sacrifice those patches there at the bottom, but there's no way around it. The client, this is a quilt made by several members of her family. But she doesn't sew, so I'm doing all of it. So I'm stitching here around I did around the perimeter, and here I am putting the lines in those light colored patches. I decided on 2 lines. In retrospect, I wish I had done 3 or pairs of 2 lines, because there was a lot of space left to fill with those teardrop feathers. The quilt is not, it's not precise. It's kind of a wonky quilt, which is what you get with a lot of old tops. So the lines are not going to be perfectly straight because the top isn't straight. Things just don't line up. And I think that only adds to this quilt's charm. It certainly has a whole lot of that. So I'm not being real careful about where these lines go. My machine has a channel lock feature that I started to use. You hit a button and it just gives you a perfectly straight line. But up against an imperfectly non-straight quilt, the juxtaposition of those two, I think, would be kind of strange. So I did use a ruler, so there is, some straightness in here, but it's not precise by any stretch of the imagination. And that's going to be okay. The batting is Hobbs 80/20. No big deal. That's going to make it lightweight and give us just the right amount of loft. So here I'm freehanding a curvy stem for those feathers. And then here I have gone ahead and done the second line. You could do one side of the feathers all at once and then go back and add that second line, but I'm getting that stem put in first this time. It doesn't really matter where they stop and start. Part of the charm of this quilt, you'll notice there are no borders. I don't know if the makers intended for there to be one, but there isn't one now. And that's fine. There's no law that says a quilt has to have borders. At the top of the quilt, the spacing is different than at the bottom. So it's just going to be a little off, and that's just going to be more and more charming. So this is a teardrop feather. It's one of my favorites. This is one I learned early on in my quilting career. It's a big feather. This is about as big as I like to make feathers. I like them smaller, slender, and graceful. You know, I think if you make them really huge and chunky, they look kind of awkward. It's just not my favorite. So I make a big feather and then quilt a little teardrop inside. There's lots of ways to make feathers. If you're new at feather making, you would get lots of good practice in with a quilt like this. It's just nothing but repetition. And I made them this way as opposed to any other way because of that teardrop. I think it's just easier to make them this way. So one of the things about feathers that you have to get used to in the very beginning is they change directions. Well, what I mean is you don't end up at the same place you started. And some appear to stand up, and others, here, this one and the next one I'm about to make, they will lie down. The more they're in that well of that curvy line, the more they lie down. And here at the top of that crest, I guess you could call it, they stand up. And I'm trying to make them big, but I'm not used to doing that. So I think I'm not really using up that much room. And there's ample room in between the lines. I'm using all one color thread. It's a polyester, a natural color that you would think would just contrast all over the quilt, but the quilting ends up being really, really subtle. So the color of the thread doesn't really matter that much. I think you could use a blue. I just didn't see any reason to do that. My source for these feathers is Linda Taylor. That's who I bought my machine from all those years ago, and that's who I learned how to quilt with in her numerous classes. This feather can be found in her book called Fancy Feathers. It's not a hardback, and there's just loads of feathers in there. After I bought that book and took that class, that really opened up a whole new world for me. And there's all kinds of great stuff in there. So what I'm doing right now is I'm echoing the feathers, and then see, I've got all that room in there to play with. So I'm adding all kinds of flourishes, which you can also find in that book. I'm putting in leaves and berries and curls and tendrils and, big fat feathers and big fat leaves and long skinny ones. I don't think feathers have any kind of gender, but the more you load it up with these flourishes, the more I think they can look kind of feminine. So, although this quilt, I think, also doesn't have a gender. The absence of floral fabrics, I think, makes it look a little bit more masculine. But all these flourishes don't make it look any less masculine. They just look really nice. As I say, the quilting turned out kind of subtle. It's a lot of fun to do this. And I was surprised at how much thread this used up. I was running out of bobbins all the time. So that was interesting. Just because, they're so big and there's a lot of decoration here. So a lot of thread use even without any kind of dense background quilting at all. And you can make those decorations go in any direction. And I love to vary the direction of things. It makes things more interesting. So that was kind of fun. So now I'm doing the other side of this big old feathered branch. And I'm not trying to get these feathers to match up, be all the same size. They're not perfectly symmetrical. There's enough symmetry here. So at the stops and starts, I'm just jumping in there and, doing partials, which is just fine. I've been quilting for 25 years, but I still have memories of when this was new. And it was, just when I'd have the top side of the branch down, then, doing the other side felt really awkward and strange. And that's a thing you kind of have to get over, and you do. So these days I've learned to make feathers in any number of different ways, and I can make them in any direction, and you get enough muscle memory going on there and it demystifies the whole thing. But gosh, back at the beginning I thought it was really tricky. It's a lot simpler here in this quilt, There are no corners to turn. It's pretty straightforward here, which is nice. So on these feathers, I'm doing a fair amount of backtracking. Where the feathers are right up against each other. One alternative to that, if you don't want to see any thread buildup, is to quilt those feathers extremely close together, but not exactly on the same line. And another thing I've done in the past, it didn't occur to me to do it on this quilt, is, where there are tendrils and curls and, other kind of flourishes, to intersperse them in between those feathers. That gets a little tricky when you're doing echo quilting, but that changes up the spacing of them, and that just gives you one more different look, another alternative. So I picked feathers because they're fast and easy, and I can do them in my sleep, and that just seemed like an efficient and maybe a little less expensive than some other ideas would have been. But we did consider some alternatives. You'll see that there are a lot of diagonal lines in this quilt, just based on the piecing. So I could have gone with that. Picked one diagonal and just did a bunch of channel quilting, or lines in pairs, or triple lines. That would still be an overall design, but in a custom way. That would have been good looking. Just channel quilting on the diagonal over the whole surface of the quilt. Another way to quilt it would be by the piece, which means you quilt each patch individually. So in the trapezoids, I could have quilted a swirl that would start at one point and go to the other, and that would be kind of continuous. And then fill in the rest of the patches, the flying geese, either with continuous curve or just whatever the mind can think of. There's any number of ways to quilt flying geese. So I've got a whole Pinterest board full of ideas that I've seen online of how people have quilted flying geese. So a lot that could be done. So here I'm doing the echo quilting and adding flourishes. Another alternative there would be just to do more rows of echo quilting. There wouldn't be anything wrong with that. That would provide a lovely texture, and that would be a lot more simple. And so, by the time I got to this part of the quilt, I'm thinking, I'm about to wrap this up. I have to get rid of those points before putting the binding on. And do we want to save those scraps or not? The client said, just, pitch them in the trash. I know there are a lot of people who are pretty thrifty when it comes to fabric. So another idea there would be save those scraps and use them to patch other vintage quilts, or sew them together like you do any other scrap and make something out of them. So I haven't tossed them. I still have them, and I'm considering what to do with them. I've not yet settled on anything yet. Okay, here's the last row. You'll see that big section where the feathers are supposed to go is going to get chopped off there at the bottom. So that will be a partial row of feathers. I've offset the stem a little bit. You know, there's ample room in here, and I'm filling in with echo and flourishes. But to get more of a whole feather in, I've moved the stem up just a little bit. So the top row that's being stitched now will be kind of the same that I've done throughout the rest of the quilt. But the bottom row of feathers, I'm not even sure. I don't think I echoed that at all. So some of the feathers will still be chopped off, but most of them will get in. And as I said earlier, this quilt is a little bit uneven and wonky, and so is the quilting. I thought, maybe that will look strange in the end, and it didn't at all. On the other end of the quilt, there is an even more dramatic partial. All I had up there was just a sliver of this section. So instead of doing any feathers at all, I just stitched in the ditch between the patches, and that served to get it done quickly and simply, and it doesn't take away from the overall quilting scheme. It didn't take all day, so that will suffice there. One word about the stem itself. As a freehander, I've become accustomed to just going for it, not planning it out, but just sewing undulating lines and then echoing that line, and then there's the stem. And I wasn't going for precision on this quilt, so that made it even easier. If you do want precision, then you've got to do the algebra and figure out, how you want the increments and when the line changes. And you could use some kind of a ruler to fit those curves in there. People have told me over the years, you must have so much patience to do this work. I do not at all, no way. And I think planning out a perfect stem, that rises and falls at particular increments, that's just, you could do that, but I think that's a giant waste of time. And of course that depends on the quilt. If it needs to be perfect, if it's a very important quilt, okay, do it. But on a quilt like this, I think we have total freedom to just go for it. So that's what I encourage. I think the only time I've ever been, the only time that's ever come up, well, it hasn't ever come up on the stem. A lot of quilt show judges want things to be perfect and precise, and I don't know how to do that. I can't get there. I think we place far too much importance on precision. I mean, I know in a show that's how you have to, that's what separates 1, 2, and 3 and beyond. But wow, the things we choose to care about. For most quilts, I don't think I think perfection is just a really arbitrary way to cause yourself all kinds of trouble. I find that as the years go by, the less I care about that at all. And I'm giving myself permission just to get it done and make it look really good. I'm a lot more interested in How creative was it? How imaginative was the quilting? Not how perfect is it? I'm just going to let this play for a while for anyone who is, just still wanting to see these rows quilted again. And I'll say that in the next section coming up, I've included a lot of time spent on the binding. The client doesn't sew, so I sourced the backing fabric and the binding fabric, and I will be creating the binding and sewing it on for her, which I don't normally do. That's not a service I offer unless it's for a client who doesn't sew. So I will say that it took a little bit of doing. I went to a couple stores, and new fabric up against old fabric, wow, there's a world of difference there. Everything looked so bright compared to these wonderful muted shirting prints. So I sourced some ticking fabric online that I just loved. I mean, I love ticking. And actually, that was the client's suggestion, which I thought was great. The color came out a little darker than I thought it would be, so that was, but that's not horrible. It's still wonderful fabric, and I picked a little floral print for the binding. And maybe that wasn't the best thing, but it looked muted enough to slide right in here without looking like brand new fabric. So that was one thing. But I sewed the binding on by machine while it's still on the long arm. So that is here for anyone who hasn't seen that done before. You can find that on all kinds of videos. That's fast and easy. I would say don't do it on an important show quilt. That's where you are going to want a lot more precision. And then I stitched it down by machine as well, which I also don't love, but it's fine on this quilt, no problem. So here's the section on binding. I like a really narrow binding. It's easier to do, mostly. So the quilt is still on the frame, nice and flat, and I'm just pinning the binding down and, just sew it. The first time I did this, I thought it was the most uncomfortable thing in the world. I tried using a ruler to help it be straight, and, now I just go for it. As you can see, the binding will show you where the quilt is not straight, and that is totally fine. So I pin to the corner, sew a little bit, and then, fold it some there at the bottom to allow for a little miter, and then repin where I need to. All the way across the bottom. So I can get this pinned down and then look at it from different angles, and I go back and straighten it up and adjust. So that's changeable until I decide exactly where I want it to be, and then go stitch it. The binding was started on the left side, and then I stitched across the length of it at the bottom. And now I'm turning that corner one more time to go up the right side. So until I get back up to the top and have another long length to stitch on the other side, here I'm just, pinning as much as I have in the depth of the throat and stitching a little bit and scrolling up, pinning, stitching some more, scrolling up until I get to the top. So lots of stops and starts, but I don't know how else you'd do that. Before I advance the quilt any, to finish the rest of the binding being sewn on, I want to cut off the bottom part of that batting. There's a lot of it, and I don't want to roll that back up. And plus, now's as good a time as any to cut off all these points. So I'm going to do that first, and then scroll up and finish putting the binding on. Okay, so we're heading down the back stretch finally. I've gone all around the perimeter of the quilt with the binding, and here is the last section. So I've got more binding than I need, and I'm seeing where, how I'm going to cut that off. So I'm going to cut it before tucking it back into the binding like you would any other binding. Sewing that down, and then we can take the quilt off and move on to the next part. Here's a look at the back. Isn't that gorgeous? You can see all those branches and branches of feathers and how pretty those look. I love that backing. It has a great texture. The fabric felt really good. And you can see the finished edge of the binding on the back. So here's the finished quilt. The client was very happy with it. I don't know that the quilting transformed it so much, but it's a charming, wonderful family piece that they can enjoy to drape over a bed, to take on a picnic or whatever, just to have out and about. It's nice to have these out and live with them, not put them up in a closet or in a chest somewhere, but to enjoy them for how beautiful and charming they are, and remind us of the people who hand-pieced these things to hand down to us. It's so pretty. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next quilt.